video is going to be all about preparing you for cracking your social work interview in Australia. So, I'm going to tell you every single bit of information that helped me, or that I wish I actually knew when I was first going into interviews. When I did my first social work interview, I remember I prepared nothing because I thought that they will just ask me about my interests, me, my hobbies, and very, very superficial basic questions. However, after my first social work interview, I was very much in for a surprise. But this taught me a lot, and with each progressive interview, I got a very good understanding of how they would go. So, in a way, it was good, but the first interview I would say was an embarrassment. So, I want to help you prepare for your first interview, and if you maybe have already done a few, maybe if I share something with you for progressive social work interviews, there might be something that you've missed out or something that you can fine tune. So maybe this video would also be helpful for you. First things first, I think it's very useful for you to have a blueprint, and this is basically a rough framework of notes that you have on the side. For every single interview after my first one, I basically had some notes because I realized that they're gonna ask me a certain set of questions. So I want to already be ready to fire out these answers because I already know what they're gonna ask. And if they didn't ask these questions, I know that they would ask me something very similar to this. So this blueprint provided a framework that I could always refer to. In this situation, I think that it's fine to have notes. Before your interview even starts, you can tell your two interviewers, and normally in the social work interviews in Australia, there are two interviewers, and they both are like, grade 2 or grade 3 social workers, sometimes even higher. And basically, before the interview even starts, you can just kind of tell them that I have some notes here, and I hope you don't mind if I refer to these notes because I want to make sure that I don't miss anything out and I'm able to offer the most robust response to give you an idea of what all I can offer to the role and the organization. All the times that I've said this, the interviewers have been perfectly happy with this response. I'd also say that when you're using this blueprint with each progressive interview, because maybe you won't get the first interview, maybe you won't get the second, maybe you won't get a job on the third interview, but basically with each progressive interview that you do with different organizations, you'll notice yourself referring to the blueprint less because the responses are more ingrained into your mind. So you'll find yourself referring less to it. For all social work interviews, I think the blueprint, I'm going to first talk about the blueprint. I think the blueprint should have a couple things, and that is firstly your strengths as a social worker, your weaknesses, what you can bring to the role, times you have resolved a conflict at the workplace, and how you've kind of kept it contained, and also social work theories and how that's applied to the work that you've done, whether it's been, maybe if you're a student, you're a fresh graduate, maybe in a student placement, and also social work theories that you think could be used in the organization or for the role that you're applying to. So with strengths, I think it's really important to kind of highlight strengths that are congruent with the values of social work or what you will be doing as a social worker. For example, maybe time management, working under pressure, conflict resolution, and also maybe conflict resolution on a deeper level would maybe be conflict resolution while also ensuring that stakeholders and parties and clients and other colleagues, other multidisciplinary teams are also on board with the same thing, so you're all working together, so it's very holistic. You can also, maybe a strength would be a patient-centered approach. That's a very strong one. And also the ability to stay focused on the task. These are all very good strengths. So basically you want strengths that would highlight your dedication, your determination, and also your ability to keep learning. So you'd also maybe want to highlight a strength that you have, which is the desire to keep learning and keep improving yourself so that you can better your practice. The desire to keep expanding your knowledge of social work practice as a means of applying it to practical use in your actual work. Weaknesses, I think for this, you'd want to remember it's important to highlight weaknesses that are actually a positive, if that makes sense. For example, you can't be having a weakness like, oh yeah, I'm not really motivated. It should be a weakness like, oh, sometimes I am too ambitious and I set myself really high targets. Because if the interviewer is kind of listening to this, they'd be thinking, okay, this isn't really a weakness. It shows that maybe they're very ambitious. So on the surface level, it's a weakness, but actually on a deeper level, it shows this person's dedication and values and stuff. Another weakness could potentially be that sometimes you're too heavily invested in the client's outcomes, and this can also emotionally stress you a little bit, but it's actually because you're just so passionate about the work. So this shows on one level that you're very invested in your work, and the weakness is that, oh, I'm taking on a lot of emotional stress, but in reality for the interviewer they're thinking like, oh, look, this person cares so much about clients and has a very patient and client-centered approach. But we can probably help them through supervision in managing this and creating some distance, so they're not so emotionally invested, but they can still bring their best selves to the social work space. So these are examples of positive weaknesses. You always want positive weaknesses, not negative weaknesses. So you want to think through these properly so that you can put this on your blueprint. Also, what you can bring to the role. I think it's really important to highlight you as an individual, what you can bring to this role. For example, in Australia, many of the cities are very multicultural. So you can probably emphasize how if you are a person of a different color, or a different ethnicity, a different background, a different race, also especially if you speak different languages, this is something that you can highlight in your role because it shows that you're able to cater to the multicultural society that is reflected in Australia, and how that's also likely to be reflected in the social workspace. This means that you can cater to a wider scope of people with religious understanding, cultural understanding, common language bonds. So you want to show that you're quite adaptable and you are also quite aware of the diversity, and your diverse background can also help create deeper rapport with patients who are from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. When you talk about on your blueprint, you'll also want to have some instances of times that you've resolved a conflict. So if you're a student, you'd want this maybe on a time that you've been on placement, how you've resolved the conflict. And if you don't have many examples, maybe you can bring that on a personal level outside of social work, or you can bring that on how you think people would resolve conflicts when it comes to the organization that you're applying for. So you can talk about how you believe that you would resolve a conflict if this XYZ happens. But I think it's best if you're a fresh graduate to maybe talk about a time that on placement you've resolved the conflict, or maybe a time on placement that you've seen someone resolve a conflict, and what you thought was good, what you thought was bad. But you'd want it as much as possible, to be related to a social work context. Normally, what I've noticed in social work interviews is when they talk about times that you resolved a conflict, or times that if they maybe give you a scenario and they say, how would you resolve this conflict? Normally, what they like to see is that you are able to keep the social work, the conflict contained. So this means what they'd hope to see is that if there's a problem between you and another colleague, then they'd want to see you kind of give a response something along the lines of, okay, I would solve this with this colleague and we try and work through it in a confidential manner away from people, so it's just contained. And if it cannot be contained, then we escalate it to a supervisor or a team leader such that it can at least still be contained within this silo. And also, of course, you want some social work theories, strengths-based theories, psychosocial, psychodynamic, all these theories, patient-centered. You want all of these theories kind of on your blueprint because you are going to be very sure that they will ask you about these theories somewhere along the line of your interview. Bear in mind now, this blueprint, what I've told you, strengths, weaknesses, what you bring to the role, times you've resolved the conflict, and social work theories, this I think is something that you'd want for all social work interviews, regardless of the field of practice. So just so you know, regardless of what you're applying for, it will be really good for you to have this blueprint prepared for your social work interview. Also, on your blueprint, I think it's incredibly important to have some questions at the end. At the end of the social work interview, the interviewers always ask a question at the end if you have any questions. And I don't think it's a good idea to ever say, oh no, I don't have questions. I think that before the interview, you should go to the organization's website and you should kind of maybe see the core values of the organization and things like this, and ask a question in relation to this. Like maybe you can say, you notice the core values are XYZ. What professional development opportunities are there in relation to this? Because I want to grow as a social worker and I want to be better in line with the organization's core values. So, this on one level shows that you've taken the initiative to go and understand the website and the core values of the organization. So, I think that interviewers will automatically be much more impressed because you've taken the effort to actually go and understand not just on a superficial level the work, but also related to this organization. So they'll already feel like you're taking a lot of initiative. And on a deeper level, it's also showing that you care a lot about your professional growth. If you care a lot about your professional growth, then from an interviewer's perspective, they're thinking that this is someone who will care a lot also about contributing to the organization because they're enhancing themselves. So whenever they ask you if you have questions, you should always ask questions that are in relation to how you can grow. What development opportunities are there? What training opportunities are there? What does a day look like in this role, and how can you bring your best self? So you want questions that are very holistic, but also show that you are very determined to contribute while you're in this role. I don't think it's a good idea to ask questions that are kind of related to money and stuff like this, because it'll automatically kind of show that your mind is set for ulterior motives. But once again, you want to reel it back into what will make the interviewers most happy with this response. Another very good question that you can come equipped with might be related to clinical supervision. This is a very big part of social work, of the profession of social work in Australia, and this is provided to social workers and all organizations. So you can maybe come with a question related to what clinical supervision looks like in the organization, how often social workers get clinical supervision, or maybe what goals you hope to achieve through clinical supervision, and if maybe this can be facilitated at the organization. Anything related to personal development through clinical supervision might offer some wonderful questions at the end of their interview that you can ask. In this video, however, I'm gonna take a deep dive into how you can crack the interviews for number one, the hospital social work context, and number two, the family violence social work context. So if you're going to be applying for roles related to either of these two, then I think this video will be particularly useful, because I'm going to take a deep dive into how you can best prepare for this. Now, let us start by talking about how to prepare for the hospital social work interview. Basically, what the interviewers are going to ask normally is, why did you apply for this role? Why are you interested in the hospital social work context? So you should come prepared with reasons on why you are very attracted to the hospital social work field of practice. They will also ask you normally what you can bring to the role. So in this case, you'd probably want to talk a little bit about the work that you've done prior in a hospital setting, whether it be as a student in placement, from what you've seen, whatever little you've done, or maybe in your previous role. For example, what you can bring to the role might be related to the ability to conduct clear and comprehensive psychosocial assessments, both that are phone-based and face-to-face based. So if you also say phone-based, that also suits a social work context in a hospital setting, because sometimes people have infectious diseases and stuff. So if you're able to show your adaptability while also doing these comprehensive assessments on the phone, that shows that you're quite tailored already towards a hospital social work context through that adaptability lens. Also, you can talk about, when you're talking about what you can bring to the role, you can also talk about how you are kind of able to arrive at suitable interventions based on using relevant information that you've gathered, whether it be through your psychosocial assessments, from interacting with the patients, from collateral information, from speaking to next of kin and other family members, from engaging with the multidisciplinary team, also from maybe gathering information from patients' medical past history. You can also talk about, obviously, the importance of always doing things while upholding patient confidentiality. Whatever social work field of practice you're in, confidentiality is one of the core tenets. So you want to make sure that in some way you're kind of mentioning this or hammering this point home as a strength, where you're always upholding the values and ethics of the social work profession by maintaining client confidentiality. You can also talk about how you're very well equipped with referrals, doing referrals within the hospital. So this could be the transition care program, GEM, geriatric evaluation and management, ACAS, the aged care assessment service, and also making referrals outside the hospital for other services. So, especially upon discharge. You can also talk about how you're experienced in liaising with family members and services for collateral information. So when we're talking about services, well, obviously family, we're talking about next of kin and direct family members. And when we're talking about services, we might be talking about maybe case managers and things of that nature. So how you're able to tease out the important relevant collateral information to ensure that you're getting the most informed plan for discharge. And also you can talk about leading back into client confidentiality, always ensuring that you're doing everything when seeking collateral information through informed consent, also in line with the social work values and ethics. You can also talk about how you've got a lot of experience working towards safe discharge and planning. Once again, emphasizing safe, meaning that where the patient is aware of what's happening whenever possible, and also that this resolution of safe discharge has been reached as much as possible with most of the people on board and in agreement with this discharge plan. You can talk about conflict resolution that comes about when working in a multidisciplinary team, and also with family members and the patient. So obviously there can be conflicting interests, but when you're talking about conflict resolution, you're trying to get as many people on the same page as possible while maintaining a patient-centered or patient-focused approach. You can also talk about how you're able to build rapport in a very short period of time. This is especially important in maybe the acute ward of a hospital setting where you're working through a very fast-paced environment. So you want to ensure that you're able to build rapport especially fast, so that patients are able to open up to you, give you the relevant information, have trust in you, and also support the discharge plan that the hospital thinks is safest for them. In the hospital social work interview, the interviewers might also ask you about the patients that you've seen. It's important that you talk about the wide array of patients you've seen, because in a hospital, you're going to see a range of patients. And based on the patients you see, that might inform the way in which you work with them. It might inform the way in which you plan the discharge, safe discharge of these patients. For example, you can talk about patients you've seen who have experienced elder abuse, maybe patients who have experienced child abuse, trauma from complex family relationships, domestic violence patients, patients of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. This would be particularly relevant if you are working in a large city which is very diverse, like Melbourne or Sydney. Also, patients from who are in the oncology wards, patients who are going through cancer, and maybe older patients who are maybe bariatric, patients who are in the geriatric wards, and also Aboriginal patients, because when you're working with patients who are of Aboriginal descent or Torres Strait Islander descent, you also need to work through safe discharge while also maintaining cultural knowledge and being mindful of their cultural needs. You are also likely to be asked about the services that you are aware of in a hospital social work context. So this is something which, obviously everything I've mentioned is stuff that you should have in your blueprint. You should also have the services that you've normally worked with or that a hospital social worker works with to show your knowledge of these services. For example, there's ACAS, Aged Care Assessment Service. There's GEM, which is Geriatric Evaluation and Management. There's HARP, which is the Hospital Admissions Reduction Program. There's TCP, Transition Care Program, home-based and bed-based. There's RACF, Residential Aged Care Facility, which I think now has been changed to RASH, Residential Aged Care Home / Nursing Home. child protection, interpreting services, especially when working with people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, also known as CALD backgrounds. There's Carer Gateway for patients or families of patients who are primary carers and they're going through significant carer stress. So there's Carer Gateway, and of course there's NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. As mentioned earlier on, they're definitely going to be asking you about social work theories. And oftentimes they ask these social work theories in the context of the work that you've done. So they might ask, what social work theories do you find most relevant in the work that you've done in the social work context of the hospital field of practice? So in this case, you could maybe talk about strengths-based approach, or maybe in this case, patient-centered approach or focused approach. So come prepared with some social work theories that you think will be most relevant um, to the hospital context. You might need to revisit your social work textbook for this, or also the good old internet, to kind of see in the context of your interview what social work theories will be most important to tease out. But definitely come prepared with the social work theories to discuss. They also would be asking you where you hope to develop your skills. So you can maybe talk about how you hope to develop your skills in clinical supervision, and the main things you might want to work on would be conflict resolution, or maybe something like patient focused approach, or maybe being able to conduct more robust psychosocial assessments that help inform your interventions, or you might want to develop your skills in terms of working more holistically in the multidisciplinary team. And the way in which you can work more holistically might be through understanding the roles of the people you're working with on a deeper level. So that can help inform the different aspects of a patient's admission and discharge. So these are all things that you can say that you know where you hope to develop your skills. They're also going to be asking you time where you also showed your adaptability, because this is very important. If you are showing your adaptability as a social worker, this shows your ability to work maybe outside the box, think laterally, and also work under pressure. In my case, I talked about how I helped to, during my placement, I helped to find the next of kin for a patient who was in the ICU, in the intensive care unit, because this person was at the end of their life. So we needed to quickly try and find out who the next of kin was, and we had no idea about this because this was not on the system, and also it seemed that the next of kin had completely lost contact with this patient. So I kind of talked about how I was able to find the next of kin and how we were able to come to a good resolution in this case. They might also ask you about how you have dealt with difficult patients. So you can maybe talk about how you kind of navigated difficult conversations with emotionally heightened family members when there was conflict, and people weren't really seeing eye to eye. The family members weren't seeing eye to eye with the patient, who weren't seeing eye to eye with the multidisciplinary hospital team. You can also talk about maybe a time that you've informed a patient about a difficult situation. For example, maybe the patient, it being in the patient's best interest to go to a residential aged care home, and the patient not being in agreement, and how you kind of resolve this to ensure that the patient's discharge needs were met while you were also kind of keeping safety as a top priority. There will also often be a case study. So for this case study, they'll read out the case study to you, and it's good that you take notes while doing so to kind of tease out the main aspects of this case study. And then there will be some follow-up questions, maybe 2 or 3 follow-up questions on how you would address this patient scenario. What I'll do right now is I'll read out an example case study to you, and we'll tease out maybe some key themes and questions, and we'll work through it together. This will give you a good understanding of what to expect for your social work interview, and it'll maybe get your brain wired towards how you can also tackle a similar case study. So here is the case study. Emily is a 35-year-old woman who has been admitted to a metropolitan hospital after a serious car accident. She has sustained multiple fractures and will require several weeks of hospitalization, followed by months of rehabilitation. Emily is a single mother to 2 children, aged 8 and 10. She is worried about their care while she's in hospital. She's also concerned about her financial situation as she works casual shifts and has no sick leave entitlements. So, in this case, the hospital social worker's role is called to assess Emily's situation while she's in the ward and to provide support accordingly. So, in this situation, obviously, you might talk about how you, as a social worker, would meet Emily. I have my notes here, so I'm gonna keep looking here. You, as a social worker, would meet Emily to understand her concerns and her level of priorities regarding herself and her family. And you'd maybe discuss the immediate needs for her, such as childcare, financial stability, and her emotional well being at this time. Now, you might also look at childcare arrangements. For example, you as a social worker might collaborate with Emily to identify temporary caregivers for her children. Emily might mention her parents, and in this case, maybe her parents live nearby town, but they need assistance with transportation and school logistics. You might look at financial support, so you might explore available financial assistance. So, in this case, maybe Centrelink, which is the Australian public benefit scheme, and community support programs. And you might help Emily or guide her in completing the necessary applications for these. You might look at emotional support, recognizing Emily's heightened emotional state at this time. She might be going through a difficult patch in her life. So, you might help to connect her with counseling services. You might ask her about if she has a mental health care plan, which she can organize with her GP, which provides for 10 subsidized counseling sessions per year. And you might also look at providing information about the hospital based mental health support that is available to her while she's at the ward. And planning for rehabilitation is something that you could talk about. You can coordinate within the multidisciplinary team to ensure that Emily has a very clear and robust plan for rehabilitation and discuss transportation options for follow up appointments while maybe her mobility is not very good. Questions that might be asked by the interviewers would be, what are Emily's primary concerns and how would a social worker address them? So, as discussed, you'd kind of talk about her children's care, financial instability, emotional stress, and you as a social worker might also address these by arranging temporary childcare and assisting with financial aid applications and connecting her with mental well being services and resources. They might also ask about what ethical considerations. Now, ethical considerations is a very big part of social work because you want to make sure that you're always putting a patient centered approach, but sometimes that may work against what a patient wants. It may work against patient confidentiality, but this is stuff that you have to weigh out. When the benefits of maybe going against standard ethics are outweighed by maybe the risks that are posed to a patient, that's where you might have to do a little bit of a juggling act and kind of see and weigh out options in a very calculated manner. So, in this case, what ethical considerations should the social worker keep in mind when working with Emily? So, ethical considerations might include Emily's autonomy, which is, of course, very important for a patient, maintaining client confidentiality, or patient confidentiality, and ensuring that the decisions prioritize the well being of Emily while she's in the ward and also outside, as well as the well being of her children. You might also get asked about the challenges that the social worker might face in this context and how you could overcome them. This is also another very common question. Challenges could include coordinating support across multiple agencies and multi level agencies and addressing these challenges with pretty limited resources. And maybe also there's a burden on these systems already, on these services already. So, how you can help to ensure that her needs are met and her voice is still heard in spite of the burden that's on these services. The social worker, as you as a social worker, could also overcome these by leveraging community networks that you have and advocating for Emily's needs within the healthcare system that she's already admitted in. So, another question might be, how does the Australian healthcare context influence the social worker's role? The Australia healthcare system it's a universal healthcare system which you might be aware of. It's known as Medicare, and it provides a foundation for access to medical care, but there are gaps in social support services which may require a social worker to navigate these complex systems and advocate for additional resources. So you can also talk about follow-up strategies to ensure Emily's long-term well-being. Um, Regular post check-ins, post just discharge would be useful. When I was working, I think it was just after a week of discharge, we just kind of call the patient or family just to kind of check in on them, and then we just kind of leave it at that. Linking in Emily to community support groups, as we talked in before, and ensuring that her children's care arrangements remain stable, especially if there's a readmission for another reason or for a same reason, because obviously Emily would be quite volatile. So we'd want to make sure that the arrangements for the children are stable. As mentioned, it's a very good idea to come prepared with some questions, because at the end of the interviewer will ask you if you have any questions. So some questions you could ask might be, how does the hospital ensure that the social work services, are integrated into the patient care experience? Another question might be what a typical caseload is like for a social worker working in this ward or department. You might also ask about what opportunities there are to move within the hospital, so you can get a taste of different patients through being in different wards. You can also describe or you can ask for a description of the types of patients you'd primarily be working with in this role that you're applying for. So here are those are just four example questions, but based on your research on the organization and on the hospital, you can do some digging in further and kind of prepare some questions accordingly. But I think these are some good questions that you can maybe that can lay the foundation for what you can ask in your social work hospital interview. Next up, we're going to talk about preparing for the family violence social worker position. So the interview might start with the two interviewers talking about how in your past you have worked in a multidisciplinary team, or what knowledge you have of working in a multidisciplinary team. Now, the reason this is very important is because as a family violence practitioner, you are going to be liaising with counselors, legal practitioners, child protection workers, housing support services, police, the court and legal system, and the AFM, which is the affected family member, and PUV practitioners. And basically, this is all to ensure safety and visibility of the victim survivor, also known as the AFM, and the children. That their safety and needs are ultimately met. In working in family violence, you always want to keep the safety of the AFMs and the children at the highest priority. Whatever you're doing ultimately has to have that vision, that end goal in mind. You can be doing things in between, like obviously having PUV insight and accountability, making referrals to services for PUVs, but ultimately this is all done with the end vision in mind, which is once again to ensure the safety and care needs of the AFM and children are ultimately met. So if you want to talk about how you have showed the ability to collaborate in a past experience and how this will be useful as a family violence practitioner, you can talk about how you maybe had effective communication and maybe regular case conferences where each team member provided updates and discussed their assessments of a case that you're working on. And you will be doing this as a family violence practitioner. For example, you'll maybe be working on RAMPS, which is a high risk panel, and also maybe you'll be working on risk-based consults with community-based child protection, which is also where you're discussing your assessment of a case because its risk has been further escalated. So you're kind of linking essentially your past work and how you've kind of worked on advocacy for clients and how that would also be useful as a family violence practitioner. You can also talk about making informed consent, how you did that in the past and how that also links to family violence. Normally when you're working in family violence, you have something called limited confidentiality, which is when basically everything is fully confidential unless there's a threat to the client or someone else around them, in which case you would need to break confidentiality. So you can also talk about the limitations and understanding of confidentiality, how that link to that work, and how it will maybe your understanding can also tie into social work ethics and also the work you will be doing as a family violence practitioner. You can also emphasize how throughout the process of your past role you made it clear, your intentions, and you maintained respectful communication, which is very, very important. And you can also talk about how you made detailed case notes to ensure that the team members who read your case notes were up to date and they had a comprehensive understanding of the case, because this is very important. Case noting is incredibly important, especially if your case notes are subpoenaed in the case of maybe a court presentation. That's where your notes will be very, very important. Also, if a client is re-referred into our service or self-refers into the service of the family violence service, that is when their past case or the past work that has been done is going to be very important, which is why your ability to write articulate and eloquent notes will be very important in your role. You also want to show how in the past you've maintained strong and transparent communication with all parties, because once again, this is very multidisciplinary. You're the service of a family violence practitioner. You're basically working with many, many parties to ensure safety and visibility of the victim survivors and children. Another question you may be asked by the interviewer could be related to well-being. The work of family violence is quite emotionally challenging. When you are working with clients who are using family violence or have experienced family violence, it can be quite difficult to process. Many people who work in the family violence sector actually have maybe a lived experience of family violence, and each time they're working, they can sometimes, revisit past trauma, which can be quite confronting. Which is why the interviewer might also ask about, how you'd manage your own well-being and prevent burnout when supporting clients during rather difficult situations that they're going through, while obviously maintaining your own well-being. Now, I also have my notes here, so I'm going to be constantly, periodically looking here. So you could maybe talk about how managing your well-being is a very important part of the family violence practitioner role, because you cannot pour from an empty cup, and in this case your cup needs to be full, and that fullness of the cup kind of implies your well-being. If your well-being is good, then you can also provide well-being to others. So to manage well-being, you can talk about how you would regularly prioritize clinical supervision and reflective practice. You can also discuss how in these supervisions and reflective team meetings you discuss challenging cases and ensure that you're processing your emotions in a regulated and healthy way. You can also discuss this through debriefing with fellow colleagues when you had maybe a particularly difficult call or difficult client interaction. You can also talk about how you, in the past, and how you will continue to maintain a positive work-life balance by engaging in activities that are outside of work to help you to recalibrate, rejuvenate, and recharge. This could maybe be practicing meditation, exercising, spending time with friends and family, and engaging in your hobbies. Additionally, you may practice self-compassion and recognize that it's okay to seek support when you need it. There's something called the Employee Assistance Program, which is available to people working in Australia, and this is provided by your organization, where you are linked in with a counselor and you get some free sessions for counseling. So this is also something that you can talking about kind of recharging and debriefing with a counselor. You can also talk about your ability to set boundaries with clients in a way that still maintains the empathy that you're conveying, but ensures that you're not overextending yourself and overextending yourself emotionally. Sometimes you can get very invested in client outcomes, and this can actually be very emotionally taxing. So you can talk about how you're committed to professionally developing those boundaries, setting those boundaries, while still being able to extend a hand and still being able to recognize the empathy. And you can also talk about maybe the importance that you're setting or emphasizing on learning new skills and techniques that make you feel more competent and resilient in the work that you are undertaking in the family violence sector on a day to day basis. Another question you could be asked would be, I guess, quite a basic one, but this would be, what do you think the important qualities are for a family violence practitioner working in the family violence sector? So, in this answer, you can talk about how you think empathy is very important, cultural awareness, because there's a lot of people from CALD backgrounds, and strong communication skills. You can talk about how empathy allows you to build trust with clients, understand their needs better, and provide the emotional support that they need during this time of crisis. You can talk about how cultural awareness is very important, because if you're living in a metropolitan city that's reflective of cultural diversity, the people that will present to the family violence service would also be reflective of this, and this helps understand the diverse experiences of clients, and also the cultural lens that they're looking through. A lot of family violence cases or clients, they also, whether they're victims or PUVs, they do also have a cultural lens that they're looking through. And when you're looking through this narrative, if you're more cognizant of this as a practitioner, you can kind of understand which aspects to tease out to create accountability on one end, but also to ensure safety. Strong communication, this is important, and you can talk about how it's very important when working in a multidisciplinary team, when working with multiple services, also when working to advocate for the victim survivor and the needs and safety of the children. It's important that their voices are heard, and you want to hammer this point home. You can also talk about resilience and self care, how that's important as a practitioner, because it can be very emotionally demanding, the job, as previously mentioned. And finally, you can talk about the understanding and the importance of comprehending on a very deep level the legal and ethical frameworks surrounding family violence, whether this be the family violence information sharing scheme, the child information sharing scheme, and also the framework that you're governed by, especially in the state of Victoria, which is the MARAM framework. You can also talk about your commitment to trauma informed practice, and it's how essential it is for providing safe and effective support to the victims and children who need it the most. The last question that I think you are very likely to be asked about would be your understanding of the MARAM framework. This is MARAM, MARAM. So, when they ask you about the MARAM framework, this will be very important as a family violence practitioner that you know about this, because much of your work with clients will be guided by this framework. So, first, it's important to establish what the MARAM framework is. You might have learnt about this in your social work course when maybe you did the family violence unit, but if you did not, the MARAM framework stands for Multi Agency Risk Assessment and Management Framework, and this is a key tool used in the state of Victoria, Australia, to help identify, assess, and manage the risks associated with family violence. It provides guidelines for practitioners across sectors of this work to work together in a coordinated manner that supports victim survivors and children and holds the PUVs accountable to their actions. The framework emphasizes a consistent, risk informed approach to safety planning, assessment, and referrals, and it also ensures that those experiencing family violence receive the right support and protection. MARAM framework is basically a very vital tool, and it ensures that as practitioners you respond to family violence in a holistic and very integrated manner. It provides a clear and structured approach for identifying, assessing, and managing the risks associated with family violence, and this is essential to supporting victims, survivors, children, and their safety. As a family violence practitioner, you would need to integrate your understanding and the practice of the MARAM framework into your work in several ways. So I'll talk about these several ways, and 6 ways actually. So the first is in initial risk assessments. So when you engage with a client, you would use the MARAM framework, the MARAM risk assessment tool, that more specifically to ensure a comprehensive understanding of the immediate and long term risks that are posed to the victim, survivor, children, and other family members. And essentially, this means understanding not only the severity or the scale of family violence, but also the dynamics of control used by the PUV and the impact on victims, and also the patterns of family violence and the consequent escalation associated with risk. Number two is collaborative practice. So the MARAM framework emphasizes collaboration between services, as previously mentioned, which is something that, as a practitioner, you need to hold at the forefront of your practice. This collaborative approach ensures that the client receives a holistic support service and that nothing is overlooked. It also ensures that there's as much visibility as possible towards the victim, survivor, and children from multiple angles. Number three is safety and support planning. As part of the risk assessment process, the MARAM framework guides the creation of safety plans tailored to individual needs of clients and their families. So you're looking at safety and support planning. And number four, as mentioned in one of the theories, is trauma informed practice. So you need to take an empathetic and non judgmental approach to building trust and encouraging disclosure. And you also need to, at the same time, recognize that every client is different, and they're also at different stages of their journey towards safety and recovery from family violence. Number five is ongoing risk monitoring and review. Family violence, you will figure out when you work in this sector, is very dynamic and it's evolving constantly. And given this fact, the MARAM framework emphasizes the importance of reviewing risk assessments and the safety plans very regularly. I would basically, you can talk about how, as a practitioner, you would ensure that the client situation is monitored on a regular basis so that you're up to date regarding the safety and the risks that are posed to them. And final would be cultural considerations. Ensuring that you consider the cultural background of individuals and their family is key to understanding that different cultures may have different ways of reacting and responding to family violence, and this may require, in turn, the different types of support that you offer. Some cultures, for example, discourage help seeking in men. Some cultures may prefer to keep issues such as family violence within the nuclear family. So as you work in this sector, you'll understand how maybe some cultures have different reactions to family violence, and accordingly you are going to tailor your service to ensure that safety is still supported and that needs are still offered while still keeping cultural considerations in view. You can be rest assured that the interviewer will probably be asking you about good old social work theories that you will integrate into your practice or that you will be seeing in your role as a family violence practitioner. Given this fact, I would like to talk about the three major social work theories that you can dissect for your interview. So the first is ecological systems theory. This is very foundational in social work, and it would be very useful in understanding the multiple intersecting factors that influences a client's experience of family violence. The theory emphasizes the importance of context, where an individual is situated in layers of environments. Now this could be from their immediate family and their community to, on a more broader level, the cultural, political, and social systems that they've been interacting with, and that are at play, and how this influences how they interact with themselves and the people around them. So ecological systems theory is a great theory that you can kind of bring up at your interview. Another very obvious one, as we talked about the draining and traumatic nature of family violence, you can talk about trauma informed care. This theory is an essential framework when working with individuals who have experienced family violence. So these are basically the victim survivors and the children. Family violence is very traumatic, inherently traumatic, and a trauma informed approach ensures that interventions are sensitive to the impact of trauma that's been experienced. And you also want to work towards minimizing the re traumatization um, while promoting a sense of safety and trust with the service. And finally, the last theory you can maybe talk about would be feminist theory. Family violence is very gendered in nature. About 95% of the perpetrators or the PUVs in family violence are probably male. And this being the case, feminist theory plays an important role in understanding power dynamics within abusive relationships. This theory examines how gender inequality, patriarchy, and societal norms about power and controlling behavior contribute to family violence against the most vulnerable, which would be women and children. Now, to end, you might also be given a case study. So, what we're going to do is I'm going to read the case study and give some example questions that might come up and the corresponding answers. This should hopefully give you an idea of what to expect for your family violence interview and the case study that might be presented to you. I want to once again say that this is family violence is a bit of a heavy topic, so this case study might be a little bit heavy as well. So if that's the case, then maybe you can skip the case study, and if you're willing to go through the case study, then also seek the necessary support if you find it a little bit difficult. So what I'll do now is I'll progress with the case study, and we can go through this together. So the case study is as follows. Melanie, in brackets mother, has reported that during the most recent incident, Ben, the father, has physically assaulted her. Ben punched Melanie's face in front of the children. Ben also broke cups and plates. Ben threatened to cut Melanie's throat. Ben also demanded that Melanie score one for him, and this is in quotations, score one for him, demanding that she buys him meth or ice, or she will never see her children again. Ben punched the walls in Aaron's room, causing the 7-year-old Aaron to wake up from his sleep and run downstairs to Melanie, who was in the living room. Melanie reported that Aaron stood next to Melanie when Ben approached her in a threatening manner. Their 2-year-old Nadia was crying underneath the dining table. Melanie reports that she was so afraid of Ben's erratic behavior that day that she believed he would seriously harm her and the children. Therefore, she called 000. This is corroborated by the L17 police report, where it was reported that the children were crying when they arrived. So this is the case study, and for context, the L17 police report, this is used by police in the state of Victoria to respond to family violence incidents. So as a practitioner, when you search the L17 portal, you will see the history of all family violence incidents for maybe the PUV or the AFM or the children. Once you search the L17 history, so L17 reports are also what is received by the Family Violence Service, and when it's received by the Family Violence Service, this also goes automatically on the L17 portal. So I'm gonna go through some questions that you might be asked in relation to this case study. So one question you might be asked is, how do you assess the risk to Melanie and her children in this situation using the MARM framework? For a question like this, you can respond by saying that in this case, the risk to Melanie and her children are extremely high. The MARM framework emphasizes that assessing both the immediate and long-term risks of family violence and this situation clearly presents multiple significant risk factors. So you can go into the risk factors. And one of them would be the immediate physical violence. Ben, for example, physically assaulted Melanie, punched her in front of children, which is an indicator of escalation in violence. He also threatened to, quote, cut Melanie's throat, which is a serious indicator of an intention to cause harm. You can also talk about the impact on children. This is very important because when children are exposed to family violence, this impacts their ability to reach developmental milestones, whether they be physical, mental, emotional, intellectual. So the children were directly exposed to family violence, as we saw in the case study. The 7-year-old Aaron witnessed the assault and ran to Melanie for safety, while 2-year-old Nadia was crying and hiding under the table. This indicates fear and distress in the children. This exposure to family violence increases trauma risk for the children, and as we said, is likely to impact their emotional and psychological development, and it can lead to consequences in their development. Threats and control tactics. Ben threatened to take Melanie's children away unless she complied with his demands for drugs. This is a clear example of coercive control and manipulation, and this is also a very high risk factor in family violence situations. And finally, there's an escalation in violence. Ben's behavior has escalated from verbal threats to physical assault. And the fact that he damaged property in Aaron's room and punched walls is indicative of a volatile and unpredictable pattern of behavior. This risk of further escalation, therefore, is significant. So, using the MARAM framework, you can talk about how you assess the risk for both Melanie and her children as high, and you would ensure that both the immediate safety needs and long-term protective measures are considered in your response when working with the family. And question number 2 would be something along the lines of what I think a question would be presented might be, how do you approach safety planning for Melanie and her children? So in this situation, safety planning is critical, given, as you addressed in the previous question, there's a high level of danger involved, a high level of risk involved for this family. So following the MARAM framework, you can talk about how your approach would be, firstly, addressing the immediate concerns and safety for Melanie and the children. The first priority is ensuring that immediate safety needs are met. And Melanie already demonstrated her ability to self-protect by taking the important step of calling 000, which is the police. And this is a very crucial action. So you can work with the AFM, with Melanie, to ensure that she's connected with emergency housing if necessary, and that the police and child protection services are involved to support her in keeping the children safe. You can also talk about safety planning for Melanie. This is very important. Safety planning is very important when you are working with AFMs. So you can talk about how you would work with Melanie to create a personalized safety plan, addressing the immediate needs such as potential further violence from Ben. This might include a few things like identifying safe places in the home where she can go to protect herself and the children, making sure that her phone is always charged and within reach, and finally identifying trusted contacts who can assist if Ben returns. You could also explore options for her to access legal support, including an intervention order, and options for securing custody of the children if necessary, so they can be in her primary care. You can also talk about safety for the children. Given the children's exposure to family violence, you could involve the child protection services to assess the impact of violence on Aaron and Nadia. For Aaron, you could maybe explore counseling to address any trauma and anxiety caused by witnessing his father's violence, and you can also talk about assessing Nadia's well-being, considering that the emotional distress she may have experienced during the incident might have been very elevated, especially for a very young child. Ongoing risk management support is also something that you can talk about. Since Ben made threats to take the children away from Melanie, it's essential to work with legal services to ensure that he cannot follow through on the threats. You can work to help Melanie be connected with family violence support services to ensure ongoing emotional support and practical support, as well as drug and alcohol services for her to explore her options around Ben's demands. And also, it's important to emphasize that you can also talk about systems abuse, which is when a PUV who is very clearly using violence and very clearly the predominant aggressor in family violence, he might be calling the police, so that the L17 report basically portrays the victim survivor as the PUV. Now, PUVs might be doing this as a means of collusion with the services. And when they're colluding with the services, this basically makes a more compelling case for them when they're presenting to the courts. Because when the judge or the courts will see that there's all these L17s, on paper, it looks like the PUV is actually the victim. However, because of systems abuse, because he's been using the system against the victim survivor in this case is actually portrayed as the PUV. And because of this power imbalance, it's more likely that the PUV will be able to meet his demands, whether it's in terms of intervention order or custody of the children, because of the way in which he's used the system as a collusion metric to basically portray himself as a victim. So you can also talk about how systems abuse is a very major issue in family violence. This is particularly in culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, where maybe the man has the upper hand because he understands English and the woman doesn't have much knowledge of the supports, or maybe the man has greater power because he has a visa and the victim survivor is dependent on the man's visa. So because of this, he might use the system as a means of further controlling her, coercing her, and also using systems abuse to kind of keep her at bay. So these are also things that you can explore. Systems abuse is a very, very big issue in family violence. And finally, you can talk about engaging with other services. Using the MARAM framework, you can talk about how you would ensure that all services involved, including housing, child protection, legal support, and mental health services, are working together to ensure the safety and well-being of Melanie and her children. So you can talk about how collaborative risk management and ongoing case coordination is very important in this situation. So if you respond in this manner, this will help to demonstrate your understanding of the MARAM framework, risk assessment, safety planning, and the need of collaboration between agencies, multi-agency approach in a family violence context. And this would also highlight the importance of addressing immediate and long-term needs to the victim survivor as well as the children. Finally, some questions that you might be able to ask. As I already emphasized, it's very good to have some questions at the end of the interview that you can ask to show your determination, or also show your investment in this process. So some questions you may ask would be, how does the agency ensure the voices of those affected by family violence are truly central to the service delivery? Another question you may want to ask is, how would you manage your own well-being and prevent burnout while supporting clients in difficult situations because of the very emotionally demanding nature of the work? So these are two possible questions you can ask. I think do your research on the family violence organization and kind of ask questions that are geared towards your personal development, and also how you can contribute to the organization on a micro and also more holistic level. So I hope with this video, it will help you to ace your social work interview. If you have any questions on how I can further support you, please feel free to mention in the comments, and maybe I'll reply and give you some further context. But besides that, if you have a social work interview lined up, I hope this video helps, and best of luck. Bye.